Afternoon, everyone. Hope all is good. Today's question comes from Joe, and we're going to do a little bit of a presentation surrounding a question. So we have, when going into a competition, whether that's for CrossFit or the week of a fight, that's boxing, or any other last week for a big event, how is it best to prepare? Obviously, you want to minimize the risk of injury or tiredness leading up, but also keep the intensity. How do you actually find the balance? So let's get into this a little bit. Only a couple of slides, but try to go a little bit more in depth with this one, just to give some of the best answer and cover a lot of the areas surrounding it. So, first off, great question. So we get into it. What the science says. So these are just little snippets taken from things like the National Strength and Conditioning Association, a couple of journals here and there. If anyone wants them, I'll send them across. So we're looking at maybe the week up to 3-4 weeks prior to competition, whether that's CrossFit or boxing. In my experience, it's mostly been working with athletes from sports, a little bit more familiar sports like boxing. It could be a football competition, a big rugby game, etc. So we're looking at maybe 1 to 4 weeks out. So the training's obviously being done, building up to that point, and then as we're getting a little bit closer to that like high competition level where we know that this is what matters, this is the key event that we've been building towards, this is what we're going to actually be speaking about. So whenever I say about that, this is what I'll be relating to. So what the science says. So a little bit of info behind that. When a taper is implemented properly, athletes can expect to see up to or around 0.5 to 6% increase in performance. Now that's a big difference from 0.5 to 6. Now obviously that aligns with some of the later points, but this just shows how different every individual is to sort of the effect of tapering and if it actually does anything for them. Obviously at the pinnacle of sport, we want as much of the small percent improvements going into that. So even a 0.5 is a massive improvement going into competition, and be getting anywhere up to 6%. That's absolutely massive. But the most important variable, which Joe did mention, is intensity and maintaining this. So this is often overlooked by athletes and coaches, but intensity needs to be maintained in order to avoid a detraining effect. So basically, let's say we are working up to or leading up to the event, maintains obviously the same training frequency, potentially volume, but we drop the intensity, then after looking around the research and studies, a lot of people being affected, a lot of athletes being affected by this and seeing a decrease in performance, probably just due to the matter of fact that they've lost that feel of what high intensity feels like, whether that's in a strength sport or an endurance sport. Let's say you're building up to a powerlifting or weightlifting competition, and up to like 2 to 3 weeks out, you haven't touched anywhere near 90%. When you get to that bar, 90% of your 1 rep max or even heavier is going to feel a lot heavier if you haven't touched it for a while. But if obviously we drop the volume, but we maintain the intensity, so we hit that maybe 1 to 2 a week rather than up to 4, 5, 6 times a week, we reduce the level of fatigue that brings with it, lifting that much. But also we maintain that feel of, okay, I still know what this feels like. That's fine. We can go into that competition. So big important factor there is make sure intensity remains the same. Research has also shown that in terms of the optimal taper, it's different, and it can last anywhere between 4 to 28 days. Obviously, the specific length of the taper is based on a variety of factors. Some of them mentioned here: athlete experience, length of the event being trained for. So it could be short and explosive, like 100-meter, could be all the way up to a marathon, and the importance of competition. You might not taper for you might not taper or deload for competitions you don't see as key important events within the calendar, and you might just use this as to see whether your training program is working, and if it is, you stay on that same path. If it isn't, make adjustments based on that. Novice athletes or coaches may want to discuss these factors with a more experienced mentor or friend. This is just because it might be seen that novice athletes may not need to taper as much, and we'll touch on that a little bit into the next slide that we'll touch on. Cool, let's move into it. So, additionally, the type of taper or pattern of taper will affect whether the athlete can successfully peak and rest. The three patterns of taper include linear, step, and progressive. I didn't really want to dive into these as much, I just wanted to give more information surrounding the question. So if you want to just type them into Google and have a little look of what these actually are. There are three different ways to potentially taper, and that's just based on how the athlete may potentially react to each one of them. They might perform better on a linear taper and perform worse on a progressive, but they might not like that side of things. So, and this is where we look at the intensity that we just mentioned previously. So I'm just going to move myself into the middle. Within 1 to 4 weeks of stopping training, highly trained athletes started to show a decrease in some aspects of performance, possibly due to the loss of feel, like we mentioned before, during training competition. So this is talking about obviously the duration you start and maybe lower the volume, mitigate the stress that's applied, etc. Study the effects of 21, 28, and 42 days tapers or a period of detraining or lower volume of training intensity. And significant improvements were shown in the 21 and 28 day group, but not the 42. So as we mentioned before, it shows that the further out you start to decrease that sort of training, maybe volume and intensity, the more of this is going to happen, the loss of feel. I don't know what it feels like to be under 90+% of the weight. I don't know what it feels like to push to them high intensities and endurance events, etc. So going into here, we have minor, moderate, and major tapers alongside of these. Understanding what might work for us, which I mentioned in the later slides, is a moderate taper should actually be practiced at least once before the major competition taper of the year. So imagine you're building up to a competition and you do something drastically out of the ordinary, like taper for 3 weeks. You lower the training volume, maintain a bit of intensity, and you just don't react well to it. We could have maybe dealt with that a little bit earlier on in the season or the year or way before this competition happened to see how the person or athlete reacts to this, whether it's an individual or team. So this is definitely a recommendation towards the end of the slide. Say this will provide the opportunity to adjust the taper to individual needs and to experiment with different combinations, i.e. linear, step, progressive, or major, minor, and moderate taper. When we look at here, so during stressful periods, this is relating to more training and with an adequate recovery, fatigue accumulates. Yeah, so we know that. So this is where the need for a decrease in maybe volume or intensity may be needed. More volume, less intensity, I should say. And we know that masking the full extent of underlying physiological and performance adaptations. So the longer we spend in training, the more our body tends to not recover. Obviously, we can do all the recovery processes, etc., but it's not fully recovered until what we mentioned here is when a training stress is removed or decreased, i.e. taper out from competition or them 21 to 28 days. There is a delayed training effect of them built up blocks of training where the body continues to adapt as fatigue dissipates, allowing a full fitness effective training period to be realized. So people tend to say, well, if I stop training like up to 28 days out, I'm going to lose my fitness. As a matter of fact, you're probably constantly in that fatigue state, even though you've got your hydration, nutrition, sleep, etc., right? That when you actually start to decrease a little bit, the stress is starting to be removed and you will have a delayed effect of them multiple sessions and blocks of training, S&C programs, etc., that will continue to adapt. So you may not lose as much as you actually think. Moving into next one, what experience says so from me? So superstitions is a big one because athletes have this sort of practice of what they do, whether that's what clothes they wear beforehand, the routine they do, what restaurant they go to. Everything needs to be pretty much the same as maybe previous winning scenarios. And you try and keep that. So you got to take that into consideration as well. Like we mentioned before, probably superstitions and don't do nothing out of the ordinary may go hand in hand. Um, like we mentioned, if you haven't done a deload and then you go, right, 4 weeks out, I'm not doing anything, that's all, I'm just going to rest for this competition, it might actually affect you on the negative side of things more than anything. So definitely something to think about. Everyone is different. What works for me might not work for you. What works for one athlete might not work for another athlete. So all through trial and error, like this training experience and journey is all about, there is no one answer fits all. Consider a sport. So something we'll touch on the next slide. There's things like weight category sports, boxing, MMA, jiu-jitsu, um, bodybuilding is another one, but takes away from this in terms of performance. A week or two out, we know that they're going to be cutting weight, could be traveling, so you need to be a little bit cautious of what you apply to them athletes. If you're still doing maybe heavy strenuous training 1 to 2 weeks out of a weight cut, they're going to be really deprived of energy, and it could affect them in a big negative way of not being able to perform on the night. The more a height of risk of injury, so you need to be really cautious around this. So obviously consider the sport. Biggest one, maintain the intensity but drop volume. As you mentioned previously, a lot. The intensity is something that you want to be taking into competition, because we're going to be performing at an intensity, if not greater than what we've done in training. Volume can be dropped, but intensity remain the same. So we start to dissipate that stress and continue to gather that adaptation from the multiple training sessions prior. Final considerations, like we touched on, weight category sports, definitely something to consider if you work with or are a boxer, kickboxer, anything to do with weight categories. When you know you need to cut weight and you're going to be really low on energy, you need to be performing movements that are going to prime you and keep you fresh rather than take a hell load of energy out of you. Traveling for competition, it's a big one. We're going to be out of routine. We're not going to be in the same training that we're doing. We're going to maybe potentially have to find gyms to train. It might not have the stuff that we want, or it might not have minimal equipment. So loads of things to think about. In terms of novice athletes, if the volume's not high, there may be no need to taper or drop the training that you're doing. This is something that you might want to talk to with the coach or somebody who's been through that before. Experience a deload or taper, so adjustments can be made. Like we said previously, you don't want to do nothing out of the ordinary. Best way is to maybe practice it earlier on the season or competition schedule with something that you don't really think is a prior or key date. But that is the end of that presentation. Hopefully we covered the question in its fullest. Have a little read around some of the research behind it. If you want me to send across any of the research around this, don't hesitate to ask me and I'll send it over. But yeah, we will catch you in the next presentation. I hope this helped.